Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Mel from What School Could Be. We are here for our September Big Think, and today we're going to explore the idea of curating the future and how museums might inspire new ways of approaching learning in schools. So joining me today are two brilliant thought leaders whose work really lives at the intersection of futures thinking and exhibit design and human connection. So let me introduce them. First, we have Kristin Alford. Kristin is a futurist and leading museum practitioner. She is the co-executive director of the Ubuntu Lab, where she brings together futures thinking, exhibit design, and communications expertise to inform the vision for the world's first global museum of contemporary humanity. She was the founding director of MOD, an award-winning futures-focused museum at the University of South Australia, where she holds an ongoing role as adjunct industry professor. She was also the lead author of Cultivating Futures Thinking in Museums. Welcome, Kristin.
Thanks for having me, Mel.
We also have today Michael Radke. So Mike designs experiences at the intersection of learning, culture, and systems change. He's been mentored by Nobel laureates and global peace leaders, drawing on these experiences and his deep knowledge in educational and cross-cultural psychology to create conversations that help people understand people. And this really informs his work as co-founder and co-executive director of the Ubuntu Lab, where he is fundraising to build reimagined civic and cultural infrastructure that supports a public understanding of humanity to create the conditions for a just and peaceful future. So we do have their LinkedIn profiles for you. Please follow them there. Michael, thank you also for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. We're excited to be here.
Awesome. So the title of today's show really references museum thinking. So I thought we'd start there. And then from my pretty limited experiences, it really appears that museum thinking encompasses two approaches. So first, it's a way to engage visitors using thinking routines, which I think is something that educators will be very familiar with. And also the second would be a design orientation that draws from the protocols of design thinking, but's more focused and tailored towards museums. So that, from my understanding, focuses on crafting the experiences, both with and for the community that museum serves. So that's my working definition, but I know the two of you live and breathe this work. So what would you either correct about that definition or clarify or expand on? And so maybe Kristin, we'll start with you and then we'll hop over to Michael.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think there are probably as many answers as there are different museums in some way. And so when we look at the spectrum of sort of museums that I've been particularly thinking about when we're thinking about future-oriented museums, there are aspects of using objects as ways for engaging people in story and using those objects as a portal to understand a period of time or a perspective or something. So I think there is something particularly useful in looking at how museums and galleries are using objects and artwork to sort of critically look at things and to be transported into a series of curious questions from that. museums are also physical spaces, so in a world which is, highly digital, the ability to be getting into a space and be surrounded and immersed by an experience, I think, is becoming a really critical part of how museums are thinking and planning for their future. So we're seeing the explosion really of kind of immersive experiences in museums. So I'm thinking of a beautiful example at the Melbourne Museum, which was all around ants as part of their natural history kind of approach. Very immersive, very digital. You could follow ants, you could move around, but it was all highly digital, highly responsive, highly reactive, and very different from perhaps looking at a ant hill as an object of curiosity. And so I think there is the object that draws people in, there is the experience of being in the space that brings people in, and then I think there's the participatory aspect of being in a museum. So you're in a community setting, or if you're a tourist, you're in a different city setting, you're with other people, it's a communal discovery. You overhear what people are talking or thinking about. It's often multi-generational experience, parents taking kids or grandparents, and so there is this sort of connected learning that's happening in a different way that you might get in a classroom of peers. So for me, those things I think are really interesting aspects of learning that museums are doing. And then I think more and more museums are kind of pushing that edge to go, and what do you think, and where is this going? And so it's less about the museum being the expert and more about opening conversations. So it's an interesting time, I think, to be really looking at how museums are thinking.
Wow. So, Mike, I'm gonna maybe build off of what Kristin just said and narrow down the question a little bit for you. So when we think about museum thinking, how does that open up all the possibilities when we're considering museums as places for both the curation and preservation, but also as hubs for people to connect, like culturally, and to really engage in civic discourse?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I come to this field. I'm 15 years into work in museums, and I still feel like a bit of an outsider. I come to it as an educator, as a cross-cultural psychologist, and someone who's really interested in creating big change in the world. And so I came to the field through science centers and found this amazing tool for change in the world. And I think that it really is because as a field, it's based around choice, and it's this really elegant moment of nobody makes, I mean, other than maybe some parents, nobody makes you go to a museum. It's a choice to go to one. It's a choice to engage in the way that you want to engage with it, to go in the order that you want to go in. It's very open and free in that way. And so it means that you're put in a position of agency from the beginning. And I think that as a tool for change, that's really critical. It's an opening for people to engage with content and learning in a way that is on their own, not only on their own terms, but meeting their needs. Because the second it doesn't, they can walk away. So I think that it's a really important adjunct to the formal learning environments that have a real strong purpose in change making as well. But they are not a place where you get to choose when or how or what to engage with as much as you do in formal environments. And I think museums are probably among the more mature formal environments when it comes to pedagogy and practice and all of the things that wrap around education and learning. So I find them to be this really incredible tool. And that's where the genesis of the Ubuntu Lab really came to the fore, was seeing this. I came through a long winding path into the museum world, and instantly I was like, oh, this is really cool to see what STEM learning has done in the last 40 years to come to this place through informal. And maybe, just maybe, it could apply to a different set of things that aren't being covered particularly well yet. So that was kind of this genesis of like, I'm interested in big systemic change. This has done big systemic change before, and it's done it through a really authentic, individual-led engagement with topics that are both exciting and challenging.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that there has been a shift in how museums have really engaged communities. Maybe in the time that both of you have been working in this field, but potentially even longer. Is that true? Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think over the last 20 years, there was a book published by Nina Simon called The Participatory Museum, which really sort of started to think about how communities could be involved in the museum. And I think what we're seeing more is not just people contributing. Like I recently went to the Oakland Museum of California, and they've got some really beautiful interactions to allow visitors to respond to what they're seeing and to make sense of the learning in the way that you would do a reflection piece, or what does this mean for me and how is it relevant? So, sticky notes on walls or voting, or there's a range of tools that we can use to get visitors engaged and responding to things. But I think also where Mike and I are interested in, and this sort of comes out of the work that I did at Mod, is how do you also help not just respond or to vote or to put in your own ideas into things, but how are you creating content and how are you shaping the types of exhibits that emerge? So we're seeing this move towards not just participatory, but actually having some ownership of content, having some community input. We see this at places like Te Papa in Wellington as well, where, Maori communities are taking, more of an ownership on objects that are theirs, and that is shifting the balance of the museum as expert and making the learning more collaborative. And I think it's a really interesting space.
So this is really interesting, and I want to layer in here maybe two references that you, Kristin, had sent me. One is an article that was called "Engaging Young People to Think About the Future," and then there was a future podcast that you sent. And just from thinking about those two things, it seems like the space itself matters just as much as the content within it. So for example, it's kind of easy to envision when you have an exhibit on climate change, for example, and that you have to hold this space of hope so that people are willing to engage with it and to look for potential solutions. But what does it look like when we're holding space for civic dialogue, or learning more broadly, I guess? It's a little different. It's harder to picture in my mind because that idea is a little bit more nebulous.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a thread from what I was doing at Mod, which was really around making sure that those spaces were a space of hope for young people. Like when we started thinking about that, teenage dystopias were all the rage in the cinema. Like it was Maze Runner and it was the Hunger Games, and it was like you don't need to go too far to kind of see that the world feels like it's breaking. And how do we create a space that honors that and recognize it, but also gives young people the agency to feel like they have some way of navigating what feels like very uncertain futures. And I think we're taking a very similar philosophy in the work that Mike and I are doing when we're thinking about creating spaces for dialogues and discussion around humanity and around the things that people are finding quite tense. So if you think about, coming into a space where you want to explore things that feel hot or feel uncomfortable, how do you create a space where that feels comfortable? And it is about meeting people where they are. It is about making sure that there's low barrier to entry. It is about listening. It is about that two-way communication between the museum and the visitor. It is really invitational, and it has to feel, one of the things that I think we've two of us have learned in many of the spaces that we've done is people are willing to engage and they're willing to be vulnerable pretty quickly. They just don't like being called out and they don't like feeling stupid. And so coming into a space which is meeting them where they are and drawing on their own knowledges and experiences as being valuable to the conversation is part of that. And I think so often we're used to educational moments being the expert delivering information, that shifting to a space which is which is more in dialogue, is part of holding that space. Did you have some other examples, Mike, from some of the workshops and the other things that you've done previously?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the very core things that we've learned over the years is not just like people don't like feeling stupid, but they enter spaces feeling like they have valuable things to contribute, and if we don't meet them as peers instead of like Kristin was saying, in this expert receiver sort of model, but when we meet them as peers, it's exciting and it's interesting and it flows really well. And so I think the big lessons that we've learned over the last decade of doing this work are really that we become facilitators of a conversation, facilitators of space, using, doing a little bit of research ahead of time to bring something to the space as an prompt for learning and exploration, but really being open to letting that conversation be shaped and be real. I mean, I think the other big thing that the other big challenge for informal and formal learning right now is being real with people. The world's moving way faster than it's ever before. People have access to information, both good and bad, like they've never had before. And if they feel like they're like that education is becoming another agenda that somebody's got, good, bad, aligned, not aligned, they see it and they've become really consummate consumers of what is real and what isn't, and what is being presented and what's not. And so it's a real challenge, I think, for the whole sector right now to come with authenticity, and authenticity that is recognizable to an audience. And so, throughout the years, we've had beautiful conversations with people in our workshops and other experiences that we've designed that really revolve around that moment of authenticity, that moment of just us all letting our guard down and being like, this is who I am today and what I'm bringing. And I may not be Mr. Happy Action Fun facilitator that you expected, or you may not be, as stupid and uninformed as the other spaces you've entered have treated you. And so for us, bringing that moment of just like, you have something valuable to offer, I have what I have to offer, and here's what it is a really core part of what we've learned over the years and what we're trying to bring into building an experience that holds that authenticity while still having the kind of trust and expertise that museums are really valuable with.
This is so interesting to me, because if we hadn't used the word museum at all in this first, 15 minutes or so of conversation, we could be talking about a classroom environment, literally. Like, everything that you've just said is the kinds of things that we hope for and we dream for our kids to have, our young people. So this is really interesting to see the parallels here between museum spaces and our traditional / school buildings kind of thing. Okay, shifting gears just a little bit. I want to think a little bit about immersion, right? So having people be so deeply engaged and encompassed that they don't feel like an outsider looking in, which you folks have both kind of touched on a little bit already. It feels really important that it's not just a strategy, but a value that you bring to your work. And so I'm going to maybe start with Kristin and then go over to Michael with a slightly different question. But at Mod, I know that there were intentionally designed spaces, right, where people were immersed and could like feel their way into the future, I think was the phrase that was used in that article. I'm wondering, what are the roles that wonder and discomfort play when you're giving opportunities for people to kind of dig into futures thinking?
Yeah, and perhaps if I broaden that a little bit, because I think a lot of the lessons that I've learned from Mod, which was a particularly future-focused museum aimed at helping young people navigate futures, are brought into the design work that we're doing for our ZM network, which is really about, again, engaging with that broad group of young adults who are on the cusp of trying to navigate who they are and who they are going to be in the world, and how they navigate difference with others. So there are some similarities there. And in the same way that at Mod, we were trying to get people to imagine themselves in different futures, through the work that we're doing in Ubuntu Lab, we're trying to get people to imagine themselves in different perspectives, and it's, so it's very similar. I find a lot of the futures thinking there is a time horizon to it, but actually what we're really asking people at the core of that is to be able to put themselves in different environments and imagine different possibilities. And you can get that from travel, you can get that from reading fiction, there's a whole range of doing it. So there's some threads, I think, that are really common to both of the spaces that we're creating. So I just wanted to kind of do that as the start, because what we're trying to do then is immerse people, almost like take them out of their everyday and put them in a different situation so that they can see a different perspective. They see new possibility, they unearth something new in the discovery. And I mean, those are the real aha moments of learning, right? And I don't think those immersions are exclusive to futures or the work that we're trying to do with the ZMs either. But I think there is something really valuable about the combination of being able to do that through the type of technologies we have available to us at the moment. So you can create really digitally immersive spaces that do feel like you're being transported. Plus, I guess, a growing awareness of things that are happening in the world. We've got access to information and we've got access to knowledge that we probably didn't have before, and access to different types of knowledges as well. So not just the learning that we might do in school, but Indigenous knowledges and applied disciplines and lived experience and a bunch of those things that we can bring to a particular moment. So often when we hear the word immersive, we're imagining a very technologically rich space where you're being plunked into something that's fully projected. But I think for the work that we're doing, immersive has those other meanings that you've talked about as well. So it is being immersed deeply in an experience or a story or a game or something that just sort of takes you through to a deeper level. And I think people crave that, because so much of our world is either screen flicking, or it's rushing, or it's very busy. And to have that moment of huge creative flow that opens up and time slows, that's a little bit about what we're trying to create, is those moments that give people a chance to breathe and to discover something new.
Yeah. Mike, before I jump over to you, there was a question in the chat from Josh, and it says, how was Mod directed at young people ages 15 to 25, and why?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a question for me, but it's also, I think, a question for what we're doing with CMs as well, which is really that focus on young adult learners. So at Mod, it was 15 to 25-year-olds, noting that any 12-year-old thinks they're 15, so it's a pretty broad age range, or that they're ready for things that 15-year-olds are. For our ZMs, maybe a slightly extended group, because we know that people are forming identity during that period. And for both of those cases, we know that age group is really underserved by museums. Museums are often, and it might be different in very many geographical locations. But in Australia, museums are often, council and state-run institutions. They have a duty to serve the public, which means all publics. So it's really hard, I think, to serve all publics. It's quite tricky. And at Mod, and what we're doing at the Ubuntu Lab, we're really focusing on where is the specific need, and where do we get the most benefit or the most social change. And for us, it is that young adult audience who are making decisions about themselves and what they want to do. And by designing specifically for that audience, I mean, at Mod, we found that was very then inclusive of adult audiences, all the way through to people in their 80s. And really the only audience we were excluding were 3-year-olds, very small children, because we weren't designing for them. And I think that's okay. And being very clear about why you're doing what you're doing and who you're doing it for means you're able to design something that is really effective and really specific. So by designing for that young adult audience, both at Mod and what we're planning in the ZMs, we're able to better target the content and the learning experiences for those people particularly, without being kind of exclusive, but knowing that that's going to have a better chance at change, and knowing that they're not often served by the offerings that exist at the moment, which tend to be more family centered.
Yeah. Okay, going back to our original question, Mike, thank you for, for waiting for that pause there. I know that in your work, you often design experiences that blur boundaries, I guess, between like science and storytelling, what was and what could be. So could you maybe walk us through very briefly on what it means to design for both like that immersive experience, but also for reflection, which is a huge part of the learning process, which involves like stepping out and maybe looking back a little bit? Or are those two completely different processes?
I mean, yes to all of that, right?
Okay.
Both separate processes, but where they can be blended is where the kind of beauty happens. So really, when we sit down to design experiences, it is architected sort of from a facilitation and a experience-driven mindset, rather than a content-driven one, or like that we have a specific outcome. And so really, I mean, you'll probably hear us say it a few more times before the hour's over. Like, this is about meeting people where they are and allowing for them to take it where they want to go. So it's building in small pauses that can allow for reflection and can allow for many different types of reflection. It might be a really deep, quiet moment of like, sit down and write some stuff now, or a prompted reaction to something, or it could just be something that is lighter in content, is a moment of laughter, or something where the seriousness breaks for a second to a point where you can take a breath, think about how you're feeling, just kind of get your feet under you again, and then move forward into the next bit. So it's very evolving, but it's also really influenced by wanting to make and leaning into the ability for museums to make individual level experiences for people. Mm-hmm. And also challenging ones. Like, it is that, like, finding the stretch zone and facilitating that zone of proximal development of, getting right up to that point. But that means building trust. That means also giving people that moment of relief, so that you're not pushing them too far into a point where they're like, I'm out of here, I'm done. Whatever you've got to say now is gone. And so, I think the way a lot of these big, heavy social topics are currently treated pushes too many people too far, to the point where most of them, A, don't even engage in the first place, or B, get in and then it's just overwhelming and they tune out or leave completely. And so it is about pacing. It's about allowing people that moment to reflect and breathe, not only as a synthesis moment or meaning making moment, but also just as a, like, is this still safe? Am I still okay? Sort of moment when, I think, especially we have to be aware of this in museums, is this is a public space. There is a level of observation that's happening. And we live in a moment where feeling safe in public is not a norm in the way that, if 50 years ago in a museum, I don't think people probably spent as much time thinking about, is somebody capturing my reaction to this?
Yeah.
And so building that all in as part of the experience is critical for building an environment not only where learning is synthesized and turned into something that then can be turned into action, but also just feels safe and okay, and like testing all the boundaries of, like, am I in my comfort zone? Am I too in my comfort zone? Am I way beyond it and now I'm just out and I need to go find a safe place to be, maybe go hang out in a cafe, or not do this anymore? So it's a lot about intention. Like, that is kind of the magic of these experiences that we are creating.
Yeah, I know that there are many, but what are maybe one or two of the indicators that you look for that tell you that this particular exhibit or display is really resonating for people?
I mean, I'm in a fortunate position where that is always reflected directly to me. Like, I just get, I'm in I'm doing facilitation. And so I've gotten pretty good at feeling that out over the years. But also being able to train people for that. We're looking for getting those moments of insight where people are making connection to their lives, where they're feeling in a position where they can push a facilitator or a piece of content to its breaking point and test it beyond that and call it on, its, presentation, like those are my favorite moments, is when somebody says, this is, you're messing with me now, like this isn't real, or my lived experience is not this, and that. And then those moments just bring this incredible moment for learning, but also exchange, and like, yeah, sure, no, absolutely, and here's the reasons we've made that decision, but you're absolutely right, that is not a universal experience, and you found the chink in our armor. And just being vulnerable with people, and the more we're able to expose that vulnerability, the deeper everything ends up going.
Gosh, I love that. And actually, before we dig into the next question, I actually want to update everyone on some pretty exciting offerings that we have in the What School Could Be community. So tomorrow, actually October 1st, we are going to be hosting an Elevating Teacher Voice event featuring Dr. Jane Shore. She's the founder and co-creator of School of Thought. Attendees will have an opportunity to hear Dr. Shore read aloud one of her articles and then have a conversation with her about it and her various works. So you can register to attend for free at whatschoolcouldbe.org/events. We also have a new What School Could Be podcast episode that just dropped yesterday. So host Josh Rapoon has put together an incredible remix of past guests that really focus on the theme of real world challenges. And you can listen to that episode anywhere that you get your podcasts. We're also really excited to share that our new documentary, Ted Dintersmith's documentary, Multiple Choice, debuted just a couple of weeks back. So if you are interested in finding out more about multiple choice and bringing a screening of this fantastic documentary to your learning community, you can go ahead and scan that QR code. And then finally, we invite you to join our free global online community of educators for more conversations like the ones we're having right now. You'll be able to connect, exchange ideas, and discover powerful stories to inspire meaningful small steps to big change. Sign up for free at community.whatschoolcouldbe.org. Okay, so what I want to do is really shift our conversation from sort of the general knowledge about museum thinking and immersion and the previous work to the current project that you're in. We've touched on it just a real little bit, called the Ubuntu Lab. So the name of it, as names are really important. So Michael, I'd love for you to just kind of explain the meaning behind it and how you decided on that for your project, your organization.
Sure. I'm going to do the very best I can on this. The easy and simple way to look at it is we are all people through other people and through our relationships with people. And so no human is a human by itself. And so our own individuality is still important and honored through a community and communal experience with other people. And so we exist in relation with other people. And the reason that I feel so humble about my own ability to express that is that the route to this came through a really special mentorship that I had over the last 20 years. And it started in 2005. I went to London to get my master's degree in cross-cultural psychology. And I concocted a really ambitious thesis project with a mentor of mine there on exploring cultures of peace around the world. And so I ended up spending time in northern India working with Tibetan refugees and thinking about how they'd explored, using nonviolence as a means for preserving their culture and fighting for self-determination there. I spent a bunch of time here in the US working with ex-civil rights leaders and people who had worked in that movement in the 60s and 70s, really amazing people that taught me a lot as well. And then I also ended up spending a significant amount of time in South Africa and had the serendipitous fortune to end up meeting Archbishop Desmond Tutu there in a darkened cathedral in Cape Town. And it was a life-changing moment, as one would imagine. And it turned into this long-term mentorship, both for the project and for my work in general. And so when it came time to found this organization, this idea that my wife Kristin and I had, when the lawyers said, "What do you want to call it?" and we hadn't done any sort of brand exploration or anything, we were like, "Well, Ubuntu is this guiding core principle in this work, and so let's call it the Ubuntu Lab and see where that takes us." And over the years, every time that we've kind of poked at, well, it's a couple of white people leading a thing that has a very African name, and is that appropriate? And should we consider changing it? The Tutu family has always insisted that we not change it. And so, they're very convincing and a bit mischievous. And so I think there's a little bit of everything involved in us continuing to have this name. But for me, it's a legacy that I carry. It's a promise to a mentor, not just to keep the name, but to keep that spirit involved and core and central to our work. And we're very fortunate to continue to have the support of Arch's family, his granddaughter, who I look at as kind of this living legacy, and this person that is really the holder of that flame for this generation is on our board. And so we have this kind of like strength behind us that carries. So it's a lovely gift that we've been given, but also a mandate to keep that as a central driving principle to the outcomes that we're looking for.
Yeah. So I know for the purposes of this conversation, we're limited on time, but for our audience, I wanted to let everyone know that there was a fantastic podcast that Mike was on called the Chattermarks podcast. And we'll make sure to drop that link in the chat for you so that you can hear a little bit more in detail about the story and Mike's journey. So let me shift back here then. So Ubuntu is really this framework for building civic empathy. Is that right? Does it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what does that look like in this project that you're working on, where you're centering humanity, not just in theory and talking about it, but in the very design principles that you're using? What does that look like?
It's a big question, but I think the clearest kind of like, if I just kind of hit a couple of highlights, I think first and foremost is that the experience is designed around facilitation. It's designed around an interaction with a human, with another person that is from your community, is of your community. We're not parachuting into cities and telling people what to think or how to think. We're really there to facilitate these conversations. So it is designed around facilitation and designed around an interaction, an authentic interaction with a facilitator, not as a display piece. It's not a museum of humanity where you go interact with people or check people out, but it is this kind of really deeply human interaction as the core mechanic in the spaces. I think the other complementary piece of that is that our topic is humanity, and we are kind of really in an exploration phase of what that means. But it's looking at the kind of underdeveloped ideas around what the social sciences are, especially at that age, and they aren't a specific domain like you have to know the principles of psychology or philosophy or political science. It's how do we think about this in a holistic way that is saying what does it mean to be human today, and how do we understand the world as humans? So we're creating a topic that is encompassing of all of that, and also, as Kristin was alluding to earlier, bringing in other knowledges, whether those are indigenous knowledges or lived experience of people who have real value to bring that hasn't been captured by the academy, or whether it's the practices and more practical domains. So we're kind of redefining this topic and centering humanity at the heart of that, both through facilitation, but also hospitality. I spent a couple of years working for Apple Retail and came to this like really interesting conclusion about what experiences could be and how change is designed for in different ways, not just in what we would all consider normal learning venues.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of learning venues that are not necessarily expected, what does the Ubuntu Lab look like right now? Like, does it look like a space that you can just walk into? I've understood that it's kind of a network. What exactly is it?
So right now we're at the start of fundraising to build what we describe as the world's first globally distributed museum. And so at the moment, you can't walk into a space, but the spaces will be defined by the experience and the work that both Mike and I have done over the last 10 years on really understanding how to build these experiences and how to engage people in activating humanity, if that's the way I can put it. You know, how to really grow the breadth of the skills, knowledges, and mindsets that we have access to, but we're probably underdeveloped. You know, we're not necessarily getting the opportunities in schools to do that, and we're kind of left on our own devices. And so the spaces that we are designing at the moment, so they're not up and running. We're fundraising for that, but they'll be retail sized, Mike said he'd worked at Apple, but if you think about an Apple store in a city, that kind of size and location where they're in spaces where people are at, we're imagining 100 of these around the world. And I think that's probably a really important thing that we haven't kind of spoken about yet, but part of the mechanism for why that global presence is important is really to enable people to connect across cultures and connect across difference. And we know that a lot of the big challenges that we're facing in the world that are at the core have a human problem. You know, we need to be able to collaborate better. We need to be able to understand each other better. We need to be able to communicate better. And so we have to do that at scale. And so the vision is to start building these spaces over the next couple of years, to scale up to 100 over the next 10 years, to really make sure that we've got this very vibrant, pulsing network of people in communication, learning how to do humanity better, learning how to understand themselves better and to get the best out of who they want to be, learning how to relate to one another better. And each of those spaces have, a few key aspects. So Mike's already mentioned the importance of hospitality. So, there is a cafe designed as part of that experience for those moments of reflection and connection. As you've just seen in the reel that just went past, they're digitally dense spaces, so they are immersive, they are interactive. It is choose your own adventure, in terms of where you want to go. And I think most importantly, the spaces are designed so that the content is really relevant, which is very different to maybe, a museum that holds a collection and that collection is fairly stable. The content that we want to do needs to be about what people are worried about and excited about in the world today. And so really looking at how we're able to make those daily moments or those things that are in the world for a week or so, how we're able to bring those into the discussion and really become a place where people can find some answers to the things that are confusing. So yeah, I think of them a little bit like I'm not much of a shopper. Like, it's not my favorite activity in the world. And I imagine walking in Adelaide, down, kind of down the mall, and, I'm imagining my daughters kind of hanging out in the shops and passing by this really interesting space that you can just kind of wander into and discover, a whole lot of stories and experiences that are delightful and thoughtful. And maybe you spend sort of 5 minutes, and maybe you spend an hour, or maybe you get sucked into something and spend longer. But that's the kind of experience that I'm imagining, or what they might look like.
And so,
did you have anything? Sorry, I was going to say, if I covered that well enough. I don't know if there's anything else to add.
I was going to ask if people want to follow along on your journey, see what's happening, how it's developing, support you. Where would be the best place for them to head to? Do you have a website right now that we can drop in the chat?
Yeah, so the best place to find out more about what we're doing is the ubuntulab.org. And really that website is designed to explain sort of the learning frameworks and the approach to the design of the spaces. And, if people are excited about these spaces, then the next thing to do is to start to get their own communities excited about bringing one of them to where they are. I mean, that kind of support, helps provide a case for us for funding, so that we can really get this off the ground. But also there's lots of information there, and we're really curious about getting people engaged in that space. And I mean, I think a lot of the other work that Mike and I are doing is, as we said, rethinking So I was just going to say rethinking what museums can be, which is very on brand for what school could be, but thinking about the redesign of a really important social piece of civic infrastructure, social institution, and thinking about what that could be for the next 20 to 30 years, on a model that is, has a long history, but how do we make that fit for the type of world we find ourselves in now? So,
well, this feels like the perfect time actually to welcome Robert Landau into the conversation. So Robert, of course, has been listening backstage, and he's this steady guide and friend and ambassador to what school could be. And in addition to that, he's also a strategist and a futurist, making him the perfect person to act as color commentator and take us a little bit deeper into this conversation. So welcome, Robert, and I am passing you my mic right now.
Thank you, Mel and Kristin and Michael. Great to hear what you have to say. And I'm going to dive in quickly and ask you a couple of what school could be or what could be school questions in relation to museums. Two quick questions, then I have a third or fourth question as well. So when you're looking at schools in general, the traditional role of the teacher is that primary source of knowledge. What about the teacher becomes a curator, which is more future focused, a connector to knowledge? And then what would that mean for the student experience if we could change the job description from teacher to curator? I want you to just speak on that from a futuristic point of view. What might that do to shift our focus on the teaching and learning relationship? And what would that mean for students?
It reminds me of a really lovely piece of futures work by Sahel Inayatollah, who was looking at libraries, and when he really interrogated how librarians thought about their work, they felt like they were in a prison. You had to sign in at the gate and you couldn't take anything out, and they changed that analogy to thinking of the library as a garden, where you could wander in and you could explore and you could smell the roses. And I think there's something nice about what you just asked in terms of what's the curator mindset that you can bring to education, which is really collecting a diverse group of, pieces of information and knowledge to spark curiosity, to spark connection, and to spark perspective taking and creativity. And I think there's something really nice about that. And I think in the current kind of context that we have, that there is also that futures piece about, that increasing agency and participation to be our own curators in the world. And so that skill set of being able to find what's relevant to us and being able to, position it and create meaning out of different things coming together is really important. The conversations I've been having with parents, friends of mine with very young children is how do we stop our children from being afraid of the world and feeling constrained? And there is something about that learning to learn that the curator mindset allows you. It's unfinished, it's unlimited, it's infinite, it's an infinite game. So I think there's something really helpful around thinking like that.
Great, thank you. Another question. There's a school listening to this broadcast right now that's about to dump a lot of money on either a makerspace or a innovation center. And they're listening to you, and last minute, they're going to call the two of you in to make a case to create a museum on their campus that is student designed, student curated, student run. And when you think about project-based learning, the exhibition of learning night, you're about to suggest creating a space that is an exhibition of learning permanent. So I want you to very quickly think, you've got a 2-minute pitch to that school because they're calling you, they're about to spend money on a makerspace or an innovation center, and they're calling you in. Why should they refocus on creating a museum space in their school?
It's a great question, right? I think the beauty of the answer is because it can be all of it, right? Museum can be innovation space, it can be maker space, and it can be more, right? Like that the beauty of informal learning environments is the broad adaptability and the broad utility of them. And so it can be innovation space when it needs to be an innovation space, pushing new ideas, experimenting with new things. It can be a makerspace when it needs to be a makerspace, allowing people to create and showcase ideas. But then it can also be a place to express yourself and showcase what your own point of view is. And so I think in a world where that has become a central skill for so much of careers, is how you find your own point of view, express your own point of view, and put that on display for the world. This is the next, 21st century skills are almost outdated and we're only a quarter of the way in. Like, what is the next 25 years? It's going to be about humanity. It's going to be about expression. It's going to be about, really driving a different way of interacting with the world. And this is a platform to play and experience and get really immediate feedback from people in a way that, making stuff and sending it out into the world is not, you don't see it. I mean, I think this is to my answer earlier about how do we know when this stuff is working. It's like, I'm there. I know because I've been watching it, and people tell me whether it's working or call me on my nonsense and send me in new directions. And so it is a maker space. It is an innovation space, but it's so much more as well.
Thank you. And that, as Josh said over in the chat, it's a yes and question, which is what I intended it to be. I want to ask a quick elephant in the room question for you, and it has to do with a saying we have in Hawaii that the lessons of the past are the key to the future, the idea of being a good ancestor. Could you please speak to a moment around the idea that there is a call now to take exhibits out of museums that may not fit the current narrative? And what does that mean for my grandchildren?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really interesting moment at the moment where we're thinking about, certainly for future-oriented museums, thinking about what it means to paint a picture of a future. And people have different impressions about what that future might be. And sometimes that's possibility, and sometimes that's a really fixed vision of one particular perspective. So it's an interesting time to be thinking about, the direction of that. So, that's just, I think that's my yes, it is a really critical time to be thinking about how we do that. I mean, I think museums have always been places where they have shaped who we think we were and who we think we are at the moment. And the perspective of the museum director or of the funder or of the particular government at the time often comes through in those spaces. And we see the same thing in school curriculum as well. I mean, certainly my experience in Australia. So the challenge, I think, is how we create broad discussion around that and allow for some multiple perspectives to come into the work that we're doing, how we create space for difference, how we acknowledge the views and the worldviews that are present, as opposed to just assuming that they are a given. And part of that is doing that unpicking and that level of critical thinking and information literacy that I think is really important. So, my straight up answer is I think it's really challenging, but it's also not a new problem. And we push around the edges. And I think some of the advantage about bringing multiple knowledges and bringing multiple perspectives is that we enhance imagination about what could be. And for the work that we're doing in designing museums, we're particularly thinking about what we would call a long present. So acknowledging the history that shapes us and thinking a generation forward, and then we don't get as stuck much in the critical present moment. We can hold that moment, but we can also hold a slightly longer time frame.
Thanks. I guess I'm going to press for a viewpoint around the fact that I'd love to hear what you have to say about the idea of actually extracting exhibits from museum as if that did not take place in our history.
I mean, I think, yes, this is the kind of one of the few existential questions in the museum field right now. And I think it's a really powerful one. I mean, I think when you're talking in the context that I think you're talking about, as far as museums of history that are trying to, what they would say curate, but some would say edit history, I think that it is a dangerous moment. I think we need to be careful about what that means and when it means the narratives that are being layered on top of that. And I think the museum field in general needs to be more proactive about owning that narrative. I think, should everything be locked in to a museum forever in hopes that we're not seen to be editing it? Absolutely not. Museums should be probably way more dynamic than they currently are. But also, I think not unlike I think education as a field needs to be more transparent about what it is trying to do and for what purposes. I think that museum curation needs to be more transparent and say, with generous honesty, saying, this is why we're making these decisions. And and then that discussion itself can live on. We live in an age where information does not go away. So I think that if that is presented well, that it almost becomes the artifact itself. And we also live in a moment where just because something's not permanently on display doesn't mean it goes away. I think in the past, museums, when they took something off the floor and they stuck it in the back room, you didn't even know it existed anymore because you would have to have known that it was there in the first place. But at this point, we can make 3D renderings, we can put on goggles and experience these things, whether there is space for them in a physical location or not. And so I think it's another yes and question for me, is like, how, rather than deciding whether something should be the thing you walk in and see right now today or not, how do we make sure that it is always available? Because most of these institutions, to Kristin's earlier point, operate with a public mandate to be sharing their stuff. And so we should have access to what's behind the closed doors anyway, or what existed 20 years ago and got destroyed or damaged.
Thank you.
Wow. Well, I think we are very, very close to the end of our hour, and I have one last wrap-up question for both you, Mike, and Kristin. It's how we end pretty much every big think. So it's, if educators can take one small step or strategy from how museums, or even more specifically the Ubuntu Lab, approaches learning in their communities tomorrow, what would be the most impactful thing that they can do?
I mean, my biggest thing, as someone who grew up the child of two educational psychologists who really thought school was where all learning happened, I think what I would love all teachers to see is the breadth of what teaching and learning is, which is a lifelong, life-wide process, and to use all of the resources available to us to facilitate that lifelong journey. So that includes museums, that includes all informal spaces, it includes honoring homes and, lives as venues for learning, and really centering ourselves as guides within that lifelong exploration. So seeing that big picture is a lovely thing, and it's freeing because there's so much more to play with. And the limitations that are currently being leveled on schools kind of don't apply out in the other world. And so that's this, for me, again, freeing exploration of what can be beyond the limitations of what is right now.
Thank you. Kristin?
Can I just say what he said? I mean, I think the only thing I'm going to yes and that as well, because I think that is the key. And I think there is just a slight reframing of purpose, in the same way that we're thinking about reinventing the museum, and particularly around the idea of what a public understanding of humanity might be. I think using that as a bit of a seed of imagination for educators and schools is valid as well. I mean, what does it mean to be really comfortable with who you are, be able to have good relationships, be able to contribute to community and to civic engagement, and to really feel like you are connected both in your own location, but also connected as a citizen of this crazy planet we call Earth. and it's a uniquely sort of human experience that we all share. So I think there is something about tapping into growing that public understanding of humanity and really valuing what makes us human and connected. That sense of purpose, I think, is the other thing I'd add to what Mike has already said.
It's terrific. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. Robert, thank you for jumping on, giving us a whole nother layer of depth to this conversation. Kristin and Michael, thank you for being so generous with your time and your thoughts and your knowledge today. We really appreciate all that you brought to this conversation here. And then to all of you who are watching us, whether it's live or rewatching the recording today, thank you so much for being part of our What School Could Be community. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.